as you can see on screen, this is Hitler. Over the decades between 1919 and 1945, Hitler was very, he was in his rise to power and then took control of the government in 1933, and all the way to 1945 he held power when he checked out in his bunker, if you will. This is his last radio broadcast before checking out. It was 3 months before he checked out, I believe. I'm trying to use euphemisms here. And I wanted to listen to the radio broadcast reconstructed with AI. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So let's give this a listen. I'll break down the historical context behind it. And while we listen to this, we're going to play some Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Should just be in the background. Won't bother you too much if you never played before. Actually, I'm going to make the game big because this is just a solid image.
Du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe.
He's so angry. Like, my God, bro. Chill out.
German compatriots, National Socialists. 12 years ago, when, as the leader of the strongest party, I was entrusted by the deceased Reich President von Hindenburg with the office of Chancellor, Germany found herself faced with the same situation internally as the one that today faces it externally.
All right, so he mentioned von Hindenburg and Chancellor and everything. If you guys don't know how the government operated at the time, before Hitler took over in 1933, there was a full-blown democracy between 1919, I think, the end of World War I, and 1933. Full-blown democracy. And it operated very much like the United States democracy does. There was a president that was elected, and the president chooses a chancellor. Kind of like how the president in the U.S. chooses a vice president, except in this case, the chancellor doesn't just kind of play second fiddle to the president. The chancellor, controls pretty much all of the political stuff. And the president, I guess he has some control over things, but he's really just there mostly as a figurehead. He can sign treaties, he can control the military, but all the political stuff is, handed over to the chancellor. So, von Hindenburg... let's see, Hitler lost an election to von Hindenburg, and then after losing the election, von Hindenburg chose Hitler as the chancellor, and it didn't take long before everything fell to pieces. Hitler created the Enabling Act, or at least enacted the Enabling Act, which gave him the ability to write executive orders with no checks and no balances, and no legislature, no Congress to challenge it. There's literally nothing to challenge him. So anyway, that was the historical context of what was happening here. But let's just step back. One more thing I wanted to mention.
Leader of the strongest party, I was entrusted by...
Oh yeah, National Socialists. He mentioned National Socialists. Socialism is very different today than what it was back then. At the time, socialism was viewed as basically just being in favor of welfare programs, like being in favor of unemployment insurance and universal health care and I don't even know, just other things like that. Social security programs, that type of deal. Except the national part at the front meant nationalist. So they were nationalist socialists. Nationalists believe everybody should be unified under the same umbrella, the same socialist government, and they should all be socialists. And if they're not, they don't belong in Germany. They don't belong as part of the country, basically. So anyway, it's really, really extreme to be a nationalist. And that extreme part is what really drove Germany down into the depths. Anyway, just a little bit of context here. Let's keep listening here.
Annihilation of the Versailles dictate led to a situation that had gradually become a permanent one, namely the existence of almost 7 million unemployed, 7 million part-time workers, a destroyed farmers' class, a ruined industry, and a commerce that had become correspondingly prostrate. The German...
The Treaty of Versailles that he mentioned a second ago, Germany was really aggressive in World War I. They lost the war, and they were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which basically said they had to pay reparations. And they had the most extreme example of hyperinflation that the world has ever seen in human history, basically. It was very, very crazy. The gold mark went from 200 gold marks per US dollar to over 1 trillion gold marks to the US. So it was crazy. Anyway, they were completely impoverished. And by the time Hitler took control, by this point right here that we're listening to, the German economy was back on track and things were going really, really well, actually. God, I don't remember where I'm supposed to go. I just played this game like a couple months ago or something. Things were going well for Germany, but in Hitler's rise to power, he needed a scapegoat to demonize, and that scapegoat was immigrants. He fear-mongered and freaked people out about immigrants as much as he possibly could, said they're not true Germans, they don't belong here, and all that other stuff. And the immigrants in the area, in fact, in most of Europe, happened to be Jews. He made all these wacky, unfounded claims about Jews controlling the government and all kinds of crazy stuff. As I'm sure most people are probably aware, but I'm starting at 0 just in case somebody isn't. Anyway, let's keep listening here. Quick interjection, this won't take long, I promise. I'd appreciate it if you watched to the end of the video, or at least a couple extra seconds, because YouTube bases its algorithm off of watch time. The more watch time a video has, the further the video will go. Also, take a look at my website, owenmorgan.com. I'm selling my book, Understanding Jehovah's Witnesses, 400 pages, and my second book, 100 Questions for Jehovah's Witnesses, which is about 80 pages. And you can find them both there on the website. Audio form, ebook form, whatever. It's about my experiences within the religion and the history of the religion generally. The 100 questions are intended to challenge a religious leader, so I'd appreciate it if you give it a read. Okay, back to the video.
7 million part-time workers, a destroyed farmers' class, a ruined industry, and a commerce that had become correspondingly prostrate. The German ports were nothing but ship cemeteries. The financial situation of the country threatened at any moment to lead to a collapse, not only of the state, but also of the provinces and of the communities.
Dude, I can't even believe that Germany didn't collapse. Like, seriously. That was crazy. That level of inflation, it was absolutely insane. Like, people were taking wheelbarrows down to the train station and filling the wheelbarrows up with just, dollars. Like, $20 bills, basically, or the equivalent of it. Absolutely nuts. They finally managed to renegotiate the Treaty of Versailles to start repayment 5 years later. And that is how they kind of started to pull themselves out of it.
The decisive thing, however, was this. Behind this methodical destruction of Germany's economy, there stood the specter of Asiatic Bolshevism. It was...
Bolshevism is communism. The Bolsheviks were was the party in Russia that eventually became the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. So when he says Bolsheviks, it means communist. He freaked people out about communism a bunch, too.
There stood the specter of Asiatic Bolshevism. It was there then, just as much as it is there today. In the years before our assumption of power, the bourgeois world was incapable of opposing this development effectively on a small scale, just as it is incapable of doing so today on a large scale. Even after the collapse of 1918, this bourgeois world had failed to realize that an old world was back.
Bourgeois, of course, it means, in Marxist literature, I believe it means just like rich and well off and so on. And proletariat is people who are like just common workers, basically. So he keeps talking about bourgeois workers or bourgeois people. He's talking about rich people.
1918, this bourgeois world had failed to realize that an old world was vanishing and a new one being born, and that there's no use in supporting and thus artificially maintaining what has been found to be decayed and rotten, but that something healthy must be substituted for it. A social structure that had become obsolete had cracked, and every attempt to maintain it was bound to fail. It was no different from today on a large scale, when the bourgeois states are doomed and when only clearly defined and ideologically consolidated national communities can survive the most difficult crisis Europe has seen in many centuries, we were granted only 6 years of peace after January 30th, 1933. During these 6 years, tremendous feats...
Oh, that's fascinating. So January 30th, 1933, 6 years of peace. So he was effectively installed as dictator and took over everything in 1933. Dude, I am so lost. Where the hell am I supposed to be going right now? In 1933, I think it was like May, maybe, when he took over in 1933, and everything just went completely downhill from there. And he says he got 6 years of peace. That's fascinating. So I get he views his rule as the only time that Germany has ever had peace. Well, from 33 to probably 39, when the war actually officially started with, like, other countries.
Were achieved, and even greater ones were planned, so many and such huge ones that they caused envy among our democratic, impotent neighbors. But this was decisive, that we succeeded during these 6 years with superhuman exertions to restore the German nation militarily, that is, to imbue it with the spirit of resistance and self-assertion, rather than to equip it with the material war potential. The horrid fate that is now taking shape in the East, and that exterminates hundreds of thousands in the villages and marketplaces.
He's saying the horrible things happening in the East. I think he's talking about Russia or the USSR or what. I don't remember when the USSR formed, but it may have been Tsarist Russia at the time. I'm not sure. Anyway, he's talking about Russia and communism and stuff generally.
In the country and in the cities will be warded off in the end and mastered by us with the utmost exertion and despite all setbacks and hard trials. But this was decisive, that we succeeded during these 6 years with superhuman exertions to restore the German nation militarily, that is, to imbue it with the spirit of resistance and self-assertion rather than to equip it with a material war potential. The horrid fate that is now taking shape in the East and that exterminates hundreds of thousands in the villages and marketplaces in the country and in the cities will be warded off in the end and mastered by us with the utmost exertion and despite all setbacks and hard trials.
Dude, I feel like he just said absolutely nothing. None of that made any sense at all. That was like a completely pointless thing for him to, like, get out of his mouth. It's terrible.
But if this is possible at all, it is only because a change has taken place in the German people since 1933. If Germany today were the Germany envisaged by the Versailles Treaty, Europe would long since have been swept away by the hurricane from Central Asia.
Right, the Treaty of Versailles he mentioned there just a second ago.
It is hardly necessary to argue with those eternal blockheads who maintain that an unarmed Germany would, owing to its impotence, not have become the victim of this Jewish international world plot.
Wow, blockhead. Can you imagine the language? Language, good sir. Quick interjection, this won't take long, I promise. I just want to say I'd appreciate it if you check my Patreon. owenmorgan.com/Patreon to find it. YouTube's algorithm goes up and down, so I can never predict where it's going to be. Having patrons gives me some level of stability. Okay, back to the video. He's talking about another thing in the Treaty of Versailles, another, like, condition or whatever. Not only did they have to pay reparations, but they weren't allowed to have an army, a fighting force larger than 100,000 foot soldiers, I believe. Which, if you know how many people died in World War I, it was absurd. How many people died in World War I? 20 million. 21 million were wounded. So 40 million people were hurt, casualties in World War I. Like, holy shit, dude, that's nuts. Some 8.5 million soldiers died as a result of wounds or disease during World War I. Perhaps as many as 13 million civilians also died. That is absolutely crazy. So anyway, the point is that they're not allowed to have more than 100,000 foot soldiers. That's like nothing compared to what they sent to the front to fight in World War I. But they sidestepped the Treaty of Versailles, that little section in there, by training with fighter jets, I believe in Russia. I forget where they were training with these fighter jets. They were allowed to have some fighter jets, but they were very limited. So they were training additional pilots to, you know, build up an Air Force stuff. Absolutely nuts, dude, that this guy's talking about this.
Such reasoning would amount to a reversal of all laws of nature. When was a helpless goose ever not eaten by the fox because she...
When is a helpless goose ever not eaten by the fox? What it's saying. I've never heard that before.
When was a helpless goose ever not eaten by the fox because she was constitutionally incapable of harboring aggressive designs? And when has a wolf ever reformed and become a pacifist because sheep do not wear armor? If there are...
So sheep don't wear armor. So yeah, so he's basically saying that it's in certain people's nature to be aggressive and violent, and others, it's in others' nature to be pacifists. And he says that he's being forced into being a pacifist, and he wants to be a wolf now, or a fox or whatever. Interesting. Okay.
Still bourgeois states who earnestly believe this. That only proves how necessary it was to do away with an era that by its educational system managed to cultivate and maintain such notions, nay, even granted them political influence. The fight against this Jewish Asiatic Bolshevism had been raging long before National Socialism came into power.
There you go. So he was tying being Jewish into communism. They demonized communism in Nazi Germany like nobody's business. Well, we've probably seen at least a microcosm of what happened in Germany with all the demonizing they do in the United States of communism. Anyway, I guess they were trying to like make people hate Jews even more by saying that like all Jews are communists or like they have a communist heart or whatever.
The only reason why it had not already overrun Europe during the years 1919 to 20 was that it was then itself too weak and too poorly armed.
So the Jewish communists in Europe were too weak and too poorly armed in Europe to force their beliefs, their communist beliefs on people. Wow, dude. Of course, that's complete nonsense. There were a bunch of nationalist Jews in Germany who were like die-hard Germans, believed it to their core, and even fought in the military. As a matter of fact, there was a propaganda campaign run against Jews in Germany leading up to World War II, where Hitler and some other people, you know, Nazis, extremists, they were looking for evidence that Jews like ran the world or whatever. And the evidence they were trying to find is that most Jews didn't fight in World War I. Almost none did. And the ones that did were only behind desks. But upon upon researching it, they discovered that actually Jews were disproportionately foot soldiers in World War I. So that little piece of propaganda didn't work out for them.
Its attempt to eliminate Poland was not abandoned because of its compassion for the Poland of that time, but only because of the lost battle before Warsaw. Its intention to annihilate Hungary was not discarded because they changed their minds, but because Bolshevist power could not be maintained militarily.
So he's talking about World War I. World War I was technically started when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Austria-Hungary, one country at the time, Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary blamed the Serbians, for the attack and used it as a pretext to like invade Serbia and just like terribly persecute them. So I guess like what's Hitler saying here about Hungary?
But because Bolshevist power could not be maintained militarily,
so they didn't take Hungary because Bolshevik power couldn't be maintained militarily. Interesting. I mean, Austria-Hungary was the aggressor. So I don't even know what he's talking about here. Really, I mean, there was terrible persecution happening against Serbs and others by Austria-Hungary. And Hitler was Austrian. He was from Austria-Hungary. He was not happy with like what was happening to his country. You know, he hated Serbs and hated all minority groups, obviously. And he used that as like the pretext to try to join the war, except the Austria-Hungary government would not accept him into the military because he was not physically fit enough. So he left and tried to join the war in Germany and was obviously successful in doing so. Funny enough, no one thought to check his citizenship. He didn't have citizenship. Anyway.
Was the attempt to smash Germany given up because this achievement was not desired, but because it proved impossible to overcome the natural resistance stamina of our people. Thereupon, Judaism began systematically to undermine our nation from within, and it found its best ally in those narrow-minded bourgeoisie who would not recognize that the era of a bourgeois world is ended, and
narrow-minded rich people is basically what he's saying here. Interesting.
Bourgeoisie who would not recognize that the era of a bourgeois world is ended and will never again return, that the epoch of unbridled economic liberalism has outlived itself and can only lead to its self-destruction, and above all...
Interesting. So economic liberalism has outlived itself and can only lead to its destruction. Of course, communism was kind of viewed as like the eventual end of left-wing economics, and that's what he's referring to. So we have a different idea of what like economic liberalism is today, but I think he's generally talking about communist economics.
All that the great tasks of our time can be mastered only under an authoritarian coordination of natural strength based on the law of same rights for all and thence of same duties. On the other hand, the fulfillment of the same duties must necessarily entail an equality of rights. Thus, National Socialism, in the midst of gigantic economic, social, and cultural reconstruction work, has also educationally given to the German people that armor without which no military values can be created. The power of resistance of our nation has increased so tremendously since January 30th, 1933, that it cannot be compared anymore with that of former times. So
the degree of resistance in the German people is so intense, there's no comparison to how intense the German spirit or whatever is, I guess, right, is what he's saying?
Maintaining of this inner power of resistance is by the same token the safest guarantor of final victory. If Europe today finds itself stricken with a severe illness, the stricken countries will either overcome this illness by exerting their full and utmost power of resistance, or they will succumb. Yet the convalescent and survivor overcomes the climax of such an illness only in a crisis that utterly weakens him. But in spite of all, it is all the more our immutable will not to shrink from anything in this battle for the salvation of our people from the most dreadful fate of all times, and unflinchingly and faithfully to obey the law of the preservation of our nation.
Dude, this guy has a way of saying absolutely nothing for 20 minutes straight.
God the Almighty has made our nation. By defending its existence, we are defending his work. The fact that this defense is fraught with incalculable misery, suffering, and hardships makes us even more attached to this nation, but it also gives us that hard will needed to fulfill our duty, even in the most critical struggle. That is, not only to fulfill our duty toward the decent, noble Germans, but also our duty toward those few infamous ones who turned their backs on their people. In this fateful battle,
when he says that, I'm wondering, like, the few infamous Germans who turned their back on their people, is he talking about Jewish Germans, I'm wondering?
There is therefore for us but one command. He who fights honorably can thus save his own life and the lives of his loved ones. But he who, because of cowardice or lack of character, turns his back on the nation shall inexorably die an ignominious death.
So if you don't fight in this war, then you're going to die an ignominious death. Interesting. I don't even know what ignominious means. What is that? Define ignominious. Deserving or causing public disgrace or shame. Okay. Could have just said disgraceful death, but whatever.
National Socialism succeeded in awakening and strengthening this spirit in our German people is a great achievement. Only when this mighty world drama will have died away and the bells of peace are ringing will realization come of what the German people owes to this spiritual renaissance. No.
Interesting. So they had a spiritual renaissance, how he's phrasing it. Hitler had this thing where he would pretend to be religious to some degree. Like, he would use religious language, but kind of out of context. Like, he said that people used to laugh when he called himself a prophet, but he prophesied all this stuff that's happening. And he's using the word prophesy in place of predict. But it was religious language that he was shoehorning into the conversation, even though he wouldn't overtly talk about God 24/7. So he's talking about a spiritual awakening here. I imagine this is probably the same thing.
Come of what the German people owes to this spiritual renaissance, no less than its existence in this world. Only a few months and weeks ago, Allied statesmen openly outlined the German fate. Thereupon, they were warned by some newspapers to be more intelligent and rather to promise something, even though nobody intended to keep this promise later. As an inexorable National Socialist and a fighter for my people, I now wish to assure these statesmen once and for all that every attempt at influencing National Socialist Germany through slogans, lies and distortions presupposes a simple-mindedness unknown to the Germany of today.
Wow, that's fascinating. So he's talking smack about people who are using short slogans and stuff. When he went to jail in 1923 for something called the Beer Hall Putsch. It was basically just his January 6th. Anyway, he went all the way to Congress and he took a hostage and everything. The crowd took hostages and said that they were going to appoint people to positions of authority and that congressmen were going to blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that was 1923, I believe. And he went to prison for high treason against the German government for 5 years, sentenced to 5 years. That is some shit right there, man. Anyway, he got out of it after 9 months for good behavior. And while in jail, while he was there, he wrote down a whole bunch of stuff about propaganda tactics and everything else, and what he planned to do, how he planned to take over Germany, or how he planned to take advantage of people. Basically, some of the key points from his writings in prison were the people, the masses, are generally feminine in thought. Not necessarily not like they're women, but masses of people are like girls, basically, is what he's saying. And girls think with their heart rather than their brain. So we have to appeal to that to bring national power into our grip. So he said we should use short slogans and distill it into single sentences and repeat it over and over and over until everybody gets it. Everybody understands it and has at least heard some part of the sentence. That was Hitler's general goal. And now he sits here talking about how the German people will not be taken in by short slogans and stuff. That's this dude is just shameless and so ready to just straight up lie to people. He just straight up lied. I mean, we know this, right? We've listened to this kind of thing throughout history class and throughout our lives, but it's so interesting to actually listen to the words and analyze it, I think.
The fact that political activities and lies are inextricably linked in a democracy is of no consequence. Decisive is that every promise given by these statesmen to a people is today quite meaningless because they are not in a position ever to fulfill any such promise. This is as if one...
So statesmen are meaningless today because they're not in a position to fulfill any promises. Interesting.
Sheep promised another sheep to protect it against a tiger. I herewith repeat my prophecy. England will not only not be in a position to control Bolshevism, but her development will unavoidably evolve more and more toward the symptoms of this destructive disease. The democracy...
So England can't destroy Bolshevism, which again is communism, if you remember.
...are unable to rid themselves now of the forces they summoned from the steppes of Asia. All the small European nations who capitulated confident of Allied assurances are facing complete annihilation. It is entirely uninteresting whether this fate will befall them a little earlier or later. What counts is its implacability. The Kremlin Jews are motivated only by tactical considerations. Whether in one case they act with immediate brutality or in another case with some reticence, the result will always be the same. Germany, however, shall never suffer this fate. The guarantor thereof is the victory achieved 12 years ago within our country. Whatever our
12 years ago was, let's see, this is 1945, so I'm trying to think. So this is 1933 when he took over. So he's referring to when he was in control, I guess, officially, and the Weimar Republic came to an end. The democracy came to an end.
Is the victory achieved 12 years ago within our country. Whatever our enemies may plot, whatever sufferings they may inflict on our German cities, on German landscapes, and above all, on our people, all that cannot bear any comparison with the irreparable misery, the tragedy that would befall us if the plutocratic Bolshevistic conspiracy were victorious.
Wow, dude, this guy loves buzzwords. You guys ever notice that? This dude's obsessed with buzzwords. Bolsheviks, plutocratic, so on and so forth. That's like all he does is use buzzwords. Just like, for example, Donald Trump uses buzzwords nonstop. A communist, Marxist. This is November 12th, 2023.
In honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
Literally an exact quote from Hitler. Like words off of his lips. Talks nonstop about communists or Bolsheviks and Marxists and that specific thing there about vermin.
And the radical left thugs that live like vermin.
That's a word that Hitler used, like nonstop. Dude is quoting Hitler right now. People just are not like catching on to this. This is wild to me.
Therefore, it is all the more necessary on this 12th anniversary of the rise to power to strengthen the heart more than ever before and to steel ourselves in the holy determination to wield the sword no matter where and under what circumstances until final victory crowns our efforts.
So we're going to use the sword and fight no matter what it takes. And if that means we die doing it, we die doing it, I guess, right?
This day, I do not want to leave any doubt about something else. Against an entire hostile world, I once chose my road according to my inner call and strode it as an unknown and nameless man to final success.
I chose my road and walked it to unknown success, okay?
Often they...
by the way, Elizabeth Culvert, thank you so much for the sticker. I appreciate it.
And strode it as an unknown and nameless man to final success. Often they reported I was dead, and always they wished I were, but in the end, I remained victor in spite of all. My life today...
This is, I believe, is probably another example of him using, like, religious tones and religious language that kind of paint him as, like, a savior, as somebody who comes in and fixes everything and all of that stuff. He's saying, like, people reported him dead, but he wasn't dead. He came back, or whatever. That's interesting.
Is with an equal exclusiveness determined by the duties incumbent on me. Combined, they are but one, to work for my people and to fight for it. Only he can relieve me of this duty who called me to it. It was in...
There you go, another example. Only he who called me to this duty can relieve me from it, is what he said, basically, right? That's really interesting. Like, another example of him kind of implying God, but not outright saying God. I mean, he does say the word God from time to time, but he really prefers to use overtones rather than overt language.
In the hand of Providence to snuff me out by the bomb that exploded only 1.5 meters from me on July 20th, and thus to...
Oh, yeah, July 20th. Yeah, that's my birthday. Yeah, there was something called Project Valkyrie, and it was an assassination attempt on Hitler, and it was on July 20th. I don't remember exactly which year, 42 maybe? Anyway, the plan was to place a briefcase next to Hitler, which contained a bomb, and the bomb was set to detonate, and it would have worked if not for the fact that somebody walked in and moved it over so that they could sit, like, where it was, completely unbeknownst to them that there was a bomb in it in the first place, and it exploded. And he, I think, broke an arm or something, or maybe dislocated an arm. I don't remember. Anyway, it was an assassination attempt that failed. And Hitler said, we are going to round up like everybody we possibly can that's associated with this, and they're going to pay. And they got like 1,000 different people that were like connected to the underground in some way. And Hitler specifically said he wanted some of them killed with piano wire. Like, come up behind with piano wire and do the job. Like, holy shit, dude. This guy is insane. As far as I can tell, interestingly, there doesn't seem to be strong evidence that Hitler ever killed anybody with his bare hands or with, like, himself. He always ordered people's deaths, but I don't think that he ever actually killed anybody. In World War I, he was a courier moving messages to the front. Maybe he killed somebody in World War I, but we don't have any actually hard evidence to my knowledge. But this dude is like depraved and graphic in the shit that he wants to do to people. Like, my God, how did he get like this? Seriously, this is crazy.
Who called me to it? It was in the hand of Providence to snuff me out by the bomb that exploded only 1.5 meters from me on July 20th, and thus to terminate my life's work. That the Almighty protected me on that day, I consider a renewed affirmation of the task entrusted.
There you go. There's another example of him kind of comparing himself to Jesus. The Almighty saved me and redeemed me and gave me another opportunity to do my life's work. And God has, like, reaffirmed that this is what he wants me to do, so on and so forth. That's kind of the deal here, right?
To me. In the years to come, I shall continue on this road, uncompromisingly safeguarding my people's interests, oblivious to all misery and danger, and filled with the holy conviction that God the Almighty will not abandon him who, during all his life, had no desire but to save his people from a fate it had never deserved, neither by virtue of its number nor by way of its importance. Therefore, I now appeal to the entire German people, and above all, to my old fellow fighters and to all the soldiers to gird themselves with a yet greater, harder spirit of resistance.
Gird up, boys, gird up. Fill your horns with oil and gird your loins.
And to all the soldiers to gird themselves with a yet greater, harder spirit of resistance, until we can again, as we did before, put on the graves of the dead of this enormous struggle a wreath inscribed with the words, "And yet you were victorious." Therefore, I expect every German to do his duty to the last. And
so he's saying, I expect you to do your duty to the last, and when your duty is done, we can put on a wreath, "You were victorious." Okay?
That he be willing to take upon himself every sacrifice he will be asked to make. I expect every able-bodied German to fight with the complete disregard for his personal safety. I expect the sick and the weak, or those otherwise unavailable for military duty.
Wow, dude. Fight. I expect you to fight with complete disregard for your own safety. And what about the disabled? By this time, he had already rounded up disabled people and put them into concentration camps and then just ordered them killed. He just said, like, the elderly and the disabled are a drain on our system. So if they're not capable of paying their way or whatever in jail, if they're not capable of, like, what do you call it? Like, not redeeming, but like giving us back what they took from us when we had to feed them, then they don't deserve to live. That was the general idea, I think, the sentiment. And it was actually, like, pushed heavily by the eugenics movement. Like, that was the idea behind the eugenics movement. Or that was what the eugenics movement led to. So anyway, Hitler killed a whole bunch of disabled people, ordered them killed. So I couldn't imagine what he's about to say here.
I expect the sick and the weak, or those otherwise unavailable for military duty, to work with their last strength. I expect city dwellers to forge the weapons for this struggle, and I expect the farmer to supply the bread for the soldiers and workers of this struggle by imposing restrictions upon himself. I expect all women and girls to continue supporting this struggle with utmost fanaticism. In this appeal, I particularly address myself to German youth. In vowing ourselves to one another, we are entitled to stand before the Almighty and ask him for his grace and his blessing. No people can do more than that. Everybody who can fight, fights, and that everybody who can work, works, and that they all sacrifice in common, filled with but one thought.
I believe it was illegal to quit your job at this point in Germany. You had to continue working.
To safeguard freedom and national honor, and thus...
He says safeguard freedom. Did you catch this? Dude's, like, unironically, dude just said he wanted to safeguard freedom. One more time.
Filled with but one thought. To safeguard freedom and national honor, and thus the future of life. However grave the crime...
Oh my, are you serious with this? Hitler literally just said in his last broadcast, we're fighting for freedom. And what was that?
Freedom and national honor, and thus the future of life.
The future of life. He's fighting for the future of life. This dude was such a joke. You know that Hitler met Mussolini. Mussolini was the Italian dictator, the creator of fascism, the fascist party or whatever. And Mussolini rose to power before Hitler slightly. And Hitler, like, revered Mussolini like nobody's business. It was crazy. Anyway, Hitler he wrote letters to Mussolini about, like, love letters, effectively. You know, I assume of the type that, like, Kim Jong-un wrote to Donald Trump or whatever, you know, the way that Trump says it. So Hitler wrote love letters to Mussolini, and Mussolini just, like, ignored them. When Germany finally rose to power and Hitler went to meet him, Mussolini said that he's a silly little clown of a man, basically. That is so funny to me. Was it because Mussolini genuinely saw Hitler as just a little clown of a man? That's possible. Or was it that he's, like, intimidated by him because his manliness was not, like, secure enough? That one's possible, too. Maybe a little both. Maybe a little of both.
However grave the crisis may be at the moment, it will, despite everything, finally be mastered by our unalterable will, by our readiness for sacrifice, and by our abilities. We shall overcome this calamity too, and this...
We'll overcome the calamity that I created. Seriously. So it doesn't matter how grim it looks. We will overcome and we will succeed. Just keep pushing forward.
Fight too will not be won by Central Asia, but by Europe. And at its head will be the nation that has represented Europe against the East for 1,500 years and shall represent it for all time. Our greater German Reich, the German nation.
I would like to take a moment to...
Oh, that was the end. Okay, thank you so much for that interesting thing, Time Unveiled. Anyway, that's fascinating, right? I'm just so fascinated by this because it's, like, I can find so many parallels. Like, not to say that we're in Nazi Germany or something. We're not, by any stretch of the imagination. But finding parallels in today's society is really interesting and concerning, and I find it valuable, if for no other reason than to simply identify the parallels and find the things that are, like, really, really bad, like, obviously bad, like, we should not be doing this. I find it so useful to listen to this simply for that, if nothing else.